Okay, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. It's wonderful to see such a strong turnout in the clear interest in building a more inclusive and accessible society. So today we're exploring something that affects us all, and that is universal design. So how we design buildings, streets, public spaces, so that they work for as many people as possible every day without accessibility becoming an afterthought or a token gesture. So universal design is about thinking early, thinking creatively, and thinking with empathy. So I'm very lucky to be joined by these three fantastic speakers today. Peter Sardena, the owner of Mobility Scooter, Walking Aids and Services, Kate Langdon, Occupational Therapist at the GHA, and Carl Viagas, Government Architect and Project Director behind many of Gibraltar's most recognisable sites. So thank you all for being here, and I'd like to start by inviting you all to briefly introduce yourself to the audience. Carl, do you want to kick it off?
Morning, everyone. My name is Carl Viagas. I used to work in the private sector many years ago. In fact, I still remember conversations with Eric. And I've dealt with projects back then, like main streets, the beautification back then. I currently work for the Gibraltar government, where I advise and I drive many projects. My passion is trying to drive what are heritage projects, which are by themselves quite problematic at times. But I've also dealt with other projects.
Thank you, Kate.
Hi. Good morning, everybody. I'm Kate Langdon. I'm an occupational therapist at the GHA. I've been qualified 30-something years now. And been here in Gib for about 18 years working across adult services with community and inpatient.
Thank you, Kate. And Peter.
Hi, Peter Sardena. I run Mobility Care Centre for the last 22 years. I've been dedicating myself to assist those, particularly elderly and those with disability, with mobility aids and services. And that's given me an insight as to how these choices of products can change people's lives and independence. And I'm here to share my experiences in the field of accessibility.
Thank you. And to set the scene, I'd like to begin with a question for all three of you. From your perspective, whether clinical, mobility-based or architectural, what does universal design mean in your field?
If you want me to...
Go on, Carl.
Okay. Sometimes I think we make the mistake here of being comfortable with just achieving minimum standards, which is sometimes complying with the law. I would treat what is inclusiveness as taking a step further, and then universal design is whereby you treat everybody the same. You try to be humanistic in your approach. I would like to try to say that I strive for that, even though sometimes it is difficult to achieve.
Kate?
So as us as OTs, have an understanding of how people function in real places. So that's essentially what we do. We look at how somebody can function in their environment, how we can make that as independent as possible and as inclusive as possible for them. So universal design is a concept that's been around for 40 years now, I think. And it's something that we do naturally, but it's now opening that up to be more inclusive for everybody rather than just the individual that we would normally look at. So.
And Peter, what would you add to that from your perspective?
I mean, my own interpretation is that it's the ability to identify obstacles that have an impact in your life with regards to going about it in the manner you choose to carry your life. If we have to look at the definition, then obviously it's very clearly defined, and if you don't mind, I'll read it.
Absolutely, yeah.
It's inclusive design aims to create products, services, which is the area that I am more involved in, and environments that are accessible and usable by many people as possible, regardless of their age, ability, or circumstances. And that has a lot of content, which hopefully today, time permitting, we can explore. But that is a true definition of universal design.
Thank you very much, Peter. And Kate, this one's for you. What are some of the design features in public buildings or streets that unintentionally create barriers? So a lot of things that many people don't even notice.
I have a list.
Go on.
So my list goes on from narrow pathways where you can't get two people past each other without somebody waiting. There's the glare from these lovely new perfect glass buildings that they're doing, which look great, but you put a bit of sun on that glass building, you're walking past where the World Trade Center is a prime example, and you just walk past and you get the glare in your eyes, you can't see anything. Poor lighting, and then there's little things like noisy hand dryers in a bathroom can really upset some people. It's just looking at those really small details. Handrails get hot in the sun. It's looking at all of those when you're designing buildings and looking at the environment that we're living in. So it can be anything. It can be a colour that can give somebody, a way-finding place. You could paint something red, and that means that they're on their way in the right place. It's looking at really tiny things like that people don't obviously notice out there in the community. And rest places is a really nice one. I like if somebody knows that there's a rest place, every 10 minutes, they're more likely to feel comfortable to go out. So it's looking at all these different things.
Yeah, and they're usually things that you wouldn't even notice on a day-to-day, no? Which is why it's extremely important to be having these conversations, because something as simple as placing a bench could give access to a lot of more people to know that they can be independent and then go out. Yeah. So how, as a follow-up to that, Kate, how does universal design support everyday community participation and independence?
So buildings, they either enable people to go out or they can be really limiting. And the lived experience we have here for the people in the room know that. And so it's going out, and it's human. Universal design brings a human element to what we're looking at. So instead of just looking at building ramps everywhere and drop curbs everywhere, which is what we used to do, now it's looking at the whole inclusive society. So it's looking at how we can make people or enable people to function in the community safely and comfortably as well. It's not just about being safe and being able to get there. It's feeling comfortable to go out in society and mix and meet with communities. And the streets, and particularly Main Street, it is an occupation. It's where people need to go and people want to go. So Main Street is where you can make your social connections. Yeah. It's where you can do, it's where, you can go down Main Street and you can, meet everybody that you need to meet down there. And people use that as a way of being inclusive in society. And so, it's really important that we bring this human element into the design.
Yeah, and Carl, I had that question later on, but I think it fits in quite nicely because of your projects with the beautification of Main Street. And so is there anything you can add? And then Peter as well, please jump in.
I think it's a good segue. With Main Street, and I'm sure that it could still be improved, but I think we have, in all fairness, and again, I'm not one to receive all the credit. There was a huge team that worked on Main Street, but that was a vision back in 1991, I believe it was. The whole idea of removing cars from what was Main Street, that was the main thrust, making it a more attractive place for all of it and for all of us. And I still remember being called "mia logoete," because the whole concept of removing the car from what was Main Street was alien, just like casemates.
Yeah.
Again, that was a car park. We don't need that many restaurants. So that was the kind of context that we had back then. But what we pushed for, and like I mentioned before, it was a concept where we tried to bring in greenery into the area, having trees, having quality material that we see. And those curbs that you see, that was a battle. So what we were pushed for is only having a couple of drop curbs in key areas to deal with those with disabilities. And I remember the team, and what we pushed for is that everybody should have the same rights to be able to go into these areas. So even though we weren't able to achieve what we wanted to 100%, I think we got 80% there. And it was the beginning of what I believe was a new vision of beautification and making things more accessible, like the toilet facilities, the piazza. That was, I think, probably one of the first toilets for those with limited mobility. Again, that was a battle at the time. But I believe that those battles were fought and won. I think right now we're in a position where these things, I don't think anybody would want to go back to having this, as I said before. And even though areas could be improved and we still have very narrow streets in some corners, we also have to realize that we live in a city that is over 1,000 years old. And there are constraints with topography and levels. So these are the difficult or the challenges that we sometimes have. So how do we accommodate for all without destroying perhaps the quaintness or the magic that the place has?
Yeah, and I think that's something that came up in previous conversations when we were talking about the panel, that Gibraltar is absolutely not perfect, but we have come a long way from where we were just 30 years ago, and of course there's a lot of room for improvement still, no?
It's also about thinking outside the box.
Yes.
Creatively, for people like Carl, like think outside the box.
Yeah.
Don't just think about, you know, the standard white male who walks the street. Think about all the people that are involved in this.
Yeah,
in
and
our
I think that's
community.
especially important that Debbie mentioned in the previous panel, that there's a lot more people with disabilities in Gibraltar today than there has been previously. And I think another important point, which I often discuss with Jenny, is that something that may not affect you today because you're not disabled, you could become disabled any day. So, you know, it's about making sure that we're building more inclusively for everyone. So if that day ever comes, well, at least, you know, your back has been covered because there's somebody like all of you doing that very good work there already. So, Peter, just turning to you, from your experience in working with mobility scooter users and wheelchair users on a daily basis, what small changes to our streets or pavements would you think make the biggest difference?
Well, I'd like to start by saying that we live in a rock, on the rock and around the rock, so that sets a lot of impediments which are being discussed at all angles today. But there are obvious things that have been repeated today, and that's the drop curves. Erecting ramps. It's not just, like Eric was saying, build it to comply or keep people quiet. It's building it with a purpose and an understanding of what we're trying to achieve. So building a ramp has to be built with the right gradient. If not, you know, it's no purpose. And there's a few examples in Gibraltar where you can say, why did they do that? You know, what is the intention behind that? Because it's not complying with anything. The width of the ramp is what is very important. Often you make the right ramp, but it's not wide enough, as Kate was saying. And now we have a lot of new products which have emerged in the market, which is supposed to be to help with mobility. And most of the designs in the older days do not comply because they didn't have those products at the time. So it's the ability to recognize the obstacles and make it better, but make it better with knowledge of the subject matter. And I'd like to add at this stage that you don't need to have a law that dictates what you do. You have to have common sense. Any government official, any designer, any architect out there, learn to understand what it means to be disabled. Learn to understand what are the pitfalls and just apply it in your job. Design it properly, consult, and make sure it works for everybody. So solve for one and extend to many. That is my philosophy. The other thing I like to add is education. I often find that the authorities resolve a problem, but then the public spoils it. A prime example of that is the recent project in North Front Cemetery. I mean, there are low curbs, drop curbs, there is access, but there's a chain in position, and people say, well, I have to lift the chain to go underneath it to enter. Well, sadly, the chain is there because some selfish members of the public would park the car there and block your path. So here we have putting things in place to stop people from using.
Yeah.
And that's sad. So education is important. Education at design level, education at social conduct. And the other thing I'd like to mention is there's a lot of frustration with regards to you haven't done this, you haven't done that. But we have to find practical and reasonable solutions. The terrain, the topography of Gibraltar gives us an awful lot of impediments. And to compromise, it's not enough. So my clients, normally what I find is that they learn their limitations. I have to teach them the limitations of the product. Often they say, I want to go and visit the apes with a scooter. Well, the scooter is not designed to climb up beyond 14%. I mean, and often say to me, look, well, why don't you design it better? Well, then it doesn't become a mobility scooter. It's now a vehicle. And if it's a vehicle, then you need insurance, you need MOT, you need to have a lot of service. So people say, well, that's expensive. If you make it expensive, the elderly won't spend the money, so they stay at home instead of going out with the scooter and enriching their lives. So we have to also understand what is the purpose of these products and what are the limitations of the products. And if I don't understand or live with my impediments, then life is harder. And you get up grumpy, and you get up fighting the world, and everything is not good enough for you. So it's a wide experience that one gets when you have a group of the community which is elderly and disabled, and each one lives a disability in different ways.
Yeah. Thank you, Peter. And just picking up on the Gibraltar's topography, I think it's a good time to ask Carl. You know, Gibraltar's buildings and terrain are famously challenging. So from the steep gradients and the historic sites, which also have to be built with that in mind. So how do you approach accessibility in major projects that you've been involved in, such as King's Bastion, the Skywalk, or even the Northern Defences now?
Warfront.
I feel like in the lion's den right now.
Oh, yeah.
First of all, I think that there's a common sense factor to many of these things, and I think everybody accepts them. But at the same time, I thrive because these are challenges, and I'm the kind of guy that in school I was always told, "No, you can't do that." That would be my motivating factor, and that's the reason why I would do it. Just probably because I would be annoying the teacher, no? And this is one of them. And Gibraltar has all sorts. Well, no, it has a very difficult topography, and I'll start off with your last one. I think many of us are very proud to be British, and that National Day will be on stage and just thumping our chest. But the reason that we are British is probably because it has been inaccessible for hundreds of years. That's basically it. It was designed, and it still is a fortress. Those walls, those covered ways, are still providing what is a very inaccessible area. Saying that, I think we've got fantastic opportunities to make these areas accessible, but we've got to be, I think, we've got to negotiate and be able to navigate that. And perhaps a few examples. I'll go to the Northern Defences, which is my latest challenge.
Yeah.
But let's start off with King's Bastion. That was a site that was obscured from many by a power station. That was a historic wall that for 200 years had not been breached. And yes, I got in trouble for going in through what is currently the Line Wall Road building. The gymnasium broke through what... There's nobody from the Heritage Trust here. That extended what was a window into a door, and that is a glass bridge, which I'm sure many of you will criticize me because it perhaps should be more visible. But the whole concept was to have this invisible walk that crosses or breaches what is a wall that had not been breached onto the King's Bastion. Then we had the two lifts there that would take us down to Queensway. So there was an integral part to making it accessible to all. I also got in trouble with that project, I remember, with the previous chief minister, because I financed or I approved what were these ramps for those with mobility, who had impairments, for them to be able to bowl. And I've got to say, I never felt, even though I did receive quite a bashing back then, but to be able to see children be able to bowl in their wheelchairs, something that I had not been able to do before, that I think made it worth it. And I think that was perhaps one example of how we could deal with historical buildings that even though they would not comply with the latest Part M's, it was a way of integrating it with the society. You also mentioned the
Skywalk.
Yeah, that was a difficult one. Again, guys, we're talking of what is at 400 meters above sea level, trying to make an area accessible. Well, the building itself, the Skywalk itself, is designed with those with mobility issues. The lift shaft that you see, that is virtually an anchor which is driven into the rock. That is what holds the whole Skywalk. Instead of having one big and cheaper, and I think that conversation went up as a get out of jail card free, what we decided to do is convert that column into 4 smaller columns, space them away, so we have a lift inside. And so that's how that project was designed, so that many could actually go onto what is one level, if not both, of the Skywalk. And the last one that you mentioned is the Northern Defences. Yep. Well, like I mentioned, that site, even when the British tried to capture Gibraltar, they did from the south. They didn't do it from the north because they knew how impregnable those defences were. Mm. So can we make them accessible to all? And I think the answer is no, and we've got to accept that. However, I think that we can overcome most of the difficulties by having lifts located at land ports. Those can take us to about 60 meters above sea level. Okay. So if not all, we can take it to a site. And what we're also looking at is having a virtual reality chamber as part of the Tourist Information Centre, so that those that perhaps cannot make it to every area are still able to explore what is not only the defences as they would see it today, but maybe take them back and give them something that perhaps the rest of the crowd cannot see. Yeah. So these are just examples of how do we try to accommodate it? And I accept that years from now I will be criticized for not being able to achieve perhaps a more successful project.
Yeah, and I think that's really important in how these historical sites are being developed going forward. Another really interesting project that's reopened this year is the World War II tunnels, and as Gibraltarians we definitely don't go up the rock as much as we should, but if you haven't, do go down to the World War II tunnels. The Right Media have done that up completely, and everything done with accessibility in mind in terms of the paneling and also the access to it, no? And of course within accepting the natural terrain that when it rains in Gibraltar 2 weeks later it'll rain in the tunnels, but it's we've come a long way from where we were, no? And just now a question for all three of you, if you want to start, Peter or Kate. Universal design often involves us balancing the different needs that we've been discussing. So how do we design fairly when a solution that helps one group may unintentionally challenge another?
No, I think it is a challenge, there's no doubt about it, but it's the creative thinkers that we need. Those people who can look at it and look at a different way of doing it, maybe designing it slightly different, like you have with to include everybody. And I think we just have to look at it that way. We need to make sure communities involved in those decisions with people with lived experience. That's where the key lies, is getting their opinions, getting them involved, and helping to design these places so that they can be used.
Yeah.
I think the prime example of that is when you refurbish old housing estates, and you have to live with what you have and adapt something to incorporate ramps. Put the right gradient, put the right width. If you design lifts, which has been a regular occurrence in most of the estates, make sure it's big enough to house the new products that we have, and not just the shopping trolley or the mundane wheelchair. There are products out there which will allow you to choose what type of mobility you want to have. So make the lifts big enough. And make sure that that goes on design concept as opposed to a keen designer or project manager who has a conscience and empathy like Carl. So I advocate education, I advocate awareness, collective participation, and try to put yourself in that place. The other thing I've noticed, which is quite smart, is I had a customer who lived in Road to the Lines, and she was very elderly, she's no longer with us. And what happened is, instead of redeveloping North to the Lines with a big curb or stair lift, she was just relocated. And she was put in Albert Riso or Bishop Caniggia or Charles Brisson, and they are examples of universal designs. So sometimes you don't have to accommodate a single person in a place which is a colonial house, and it will cost too much to redevelop the whole house. Sometimes it's better to recognize that they fall into an age where we can seek more comfortable life in relocating them to better premises. And that, I think, is a transition that we are seeing more and more of, and I welcome.
Yeah, and if you may, I don't know if we can get a roaming microphone to Benji, who's just here in the audience, and he's staring at me square in the face, giving me the timings left. But I think it's really important that we hear from you, because I remember we had a very interesting conversation, must have been 2-3 years ago now, where we were talking about, well, Benji, how do we get the most inclusive society, and how do we become fair for everybody? And I think you gave me the perfect example about the tactile pavements.
Yeah, I think one of the things you've got to consider with universal design is that in trying to do that, you may come across groups of people that have conflicting needs. Mm. So when you think about tactile paving, so like the raised pavements or the crossings, people with visual differences or people who are blind use that to navigate, to help them find their way. But for someone in a wheelchair, for example, it can cause an obstacle for me, having my wheels have difficulty navigating that sort of flooring, or people with arthritis in the feet, for example, may find it painful to walk on. You know, you have to realize that there will be these conflicting needs, and you try and balance them as best as you can. There is not going to be this one-size-fits-all approach to it all.
Yeah, thank you very much, Benji. And I think that's when I really understood. I was like, right, we're never going to build a world that is fair for everybody, but how can we start adjusting things to make sure that we're adapting to make sure we fit as many
challenging
people?
those people
Yeah.
who are designing it to think about it, you know, and to incorporate that in their design work.
Absolutely. Carl, yeah?
Well, it's a very valid point that Benji has raised, and there are usually these paradoxes that what is ideal for one can create what is a real problem for another person. But we are just focusing on what I refer to as Part M, which is the UK approved documents, which I tend to use. Ours are very dated, so I'll use that as a mark. But Part M is one of about 20 different parts. We go from Part A to other that as an architect I've got to deal with. So even though within Part M you'll have conflicts, imagine when you bring structure, issues with energy performance, electrical. So it's sometimes not the get out of close, get wet and we go, it's very expensive. Sometimes there are other issues that will also bear and provide challenges to an architect. And you can imagine, sometimes it's difficult to get a few of us to agree on one thing. When you have all these parts, each of them represented by a department, that then has to go to a body, it's that one person that will need to then take the decision on what kind of design solution to use. And you can imagine that that person would not please what is, or be able to satisfy all. I think one example that I can bring, and I think it was Jenny that raised it, a valid criticism of the castle streets, what is Calle Comedia, where the gradients on some of those ramps do not comply. And that is a valid criticism, and she is absolutely correct. But again, I don't find any excuses on a new build, because these ramps, they are stipulated, and if somebody doesn't know, he should seek advice on what the gradients are, the heights of handrails. But when you're talking of a landscape which is historic, like Calle Comedia, even though we redid the whole thing, the landings are dictated by the entrances to historic buildings. So once you establish that there is a flat area on each and every single area, the gradient of ramps is virtually dictated to you. The decision there was one where I was asked not to have any ramps. So I think it's better to have perhaps some ramps which, even though they might not comply, they might make life easier than not to have any ramps whatsoever.
Yeah.
However, there should be other sites that have got lifts or other elements that should be maintained, and that I think is a problem that we as a society fail.
Yeah. Sorry, because we've got 1 minute on the clock, and I think this is a really important one. And Peter, if you can make your point here, if it's not this question, but this was more of a cultural question. So how do we encourage better community behaviour, like thoughtful parking, keeping pavements clear, and being aware of others? So accessibility becomes a shared responsibility rather than that individual's problem.
Well, I made the point earlier about people's conscience and people's awareness, but I failed to address something which I come across, or my customers come across very often, and those who live in housing estates like Montague Gardens, Water Gardens, Harbour Views, and would you believe it that committee members do not want them to keep their scooters outside their door? Now, here we have a case where somebody who lives there chooses a product which is perfectly legal to enrich their lives and improve their independence, and yet fellow committee members of the same estate approach them and tell them you cannot or you shouldn't keep your scooter on your front door. Now, my answer to that is insist on your rights. This is not a toy, this is not an e-bike, this is, ironically, according to UK law, is classified in law as an invalid carriage, which is a wrong language, but it's the law. And in Europe it's a medical device. It's something which you rely on to enrich your life. And yet, some of these people insist in such a way that we have to engage with lawyers and doctors to prove that this person has enough disability to need a mobility scooter. And that to me is very sad, because those committee members clearly do not understand anything about living with impairment. And by the way, you don't have to be tetraplegic to be disabled. You can be just old. You can have aches, angina, recovering from an operation. Often I see people say, he doesn't need a scooter. I know him very well. Hang on, how do you know his medical condition? And to me, it's very sad that most of the problems that I face, those which are physical, we have the authorities and we have means to put pressure. But those which are human related, I find it most sad, And may I appeal today to all of you that whatever influence you may have in your part of your community, particularly in the estates that you may live in, write into your committee and make sure you voice your discontent for their approach.
Thank you, Peter. And I've been asked to stop already, but I've got to just give you 30 seconds each to wrap up. Kate and Carl. Go on, Kate.
So really, I just think we need to look at how we engage communities and engage people in making these decisions and engage them with the policymakers so that these decisions can be made, so that the streets can become inclusive and people can feel comfortable to go out. There's a really nice thing about characters, and I think it was an architect that thought of it, and it's just about spending 2 minutes or holding something really heavy in your arms and trying to open a door. It's about living it for that moment and then realizing that that's what people do every day. So it's like, or feeling really, really tired and then making yourself go up the steps rather than in the lift or whatever.
Yeah.
And just doing those little things to gain an insight into how we need to change our community.
Thank you, Kate. And Carl?
I was once told by a lecturer, I designed a plan and it was all over the place. And he asked me, well, Carl, how are your clients, visitors, going to be able to get to the bath, what have you? I said, well, we just place signs all over the place. Mm. And he told me, so Carl, the day that you have to rely on signs is when architecture dies. And I think that really hit me, and I only realized it later. You have to design without the need to point people in a certain direction. So I think having an open mind, having good designers is empathetic. We shouldn't rely on the legislation, really, on that. But I think it starts off with education. And perhaps, call me cynical, I've given up on the older crowd, on my older clients. And I think it starts with our children. I think they are the ones we have to reach to. They're the ones that are going to be teaching us. So I think in terms of education, that focus has got to be on them.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Kate. And thank you, Carl. And thank you all for being here today.